За лаштунками допомоги. Подкаст про гуманітарне реагування та допомогу від Open Space Works Ukraine та Радіо Сковорода.
Ну що ж, друзі, я усіх вітаю. Подкаст «За лаштунками допомоги» повертається з другим сезоном і у такому собі оновленому форматі. За мікрофоном я, Тетяна Вдовиченко. Мене ви могли чути у інших подкастах, наприклад, як у подкасті з Медспейс, подкаст здорової людини, або ж на виїзних мандрівних студіях Радіо Сковорода. А зараз кілька епізодів у другому сезоні я проведу разом з вами, і разом з вами буду досліджувати гуманітарну сферу і те, як зараз вона функціонує в Україні і як може функціонувати краще. Усе це ми робимо у межах одного дня та одного форуму, на якому обговорюємо два дослідження щодо жінок у гуманітарній сфері та молодих людей у гуманітарній сфері і їхнього впливу на усе те, що тут відбувається. Відповідно, будемо цупити спікерів та спікерок із конференції для того, щоб могти з ними обговорити різні теми, і маю заанонсувати, що кілька епізодів у нас будуть англійською, і сьогодні один з них такий. Будемо говорити з Іззі Квілтер, це керівниця відділу досліджень в Академії гуманітарного лідерства, і я переходжу на англійську мову. Я сподіваюся, що вам все буде зрозуміло, тому що дуже хочемо це зробити доступним для всіх. Якщо ви щось не зрозуміли, то обіцяємо, що у соцмережах все детально опишемо, там будуть різні горталки, тому заходьте на Радіо Сковорода, дивіться, читайте та дізнавайтесь більше про добрі справи, тому що гуманітарна сфера – це те, що творить добро. Okay, Іззі, I finished in Ukrainian. I moved to English. It's Іззі Квілтер. With her, we explore what feminist leadership actually means in practice, not just as value, but as a way of doing things differently. And I think we will examine the contradiction between grassroots and global interruptions and ask who defines feminist leadership and in humanitarian work today and who should. So Іззі, hi.
Hi.
Nice to meet you in Ukraine. Let's start simple. What does feminist leadership mean to you personally in the context of humanitarian work?
Quite a big question. So I think feminist leadership isn't just about women's involvement in humanitarianism, although that's part of it. It's actually, to me, about doing things a little bit differently. And it's about moving away from the kind of dominant tropes in humanitarianism, which can feel quite colonial, quite patriarchal, and where kind of Western INGOs, etc., are kind of dominant or often in leadership positions. And so I think one of the things that the HLA, where I'm head of research and evidence, have been looking at is understanding how feminist leadership can kind of be encouraged or show up better in humanitarian work, and also look for places where it's already happening. I think a lot of INGOs have sort of taken over the term feminist leadership or feminist principles in the ways that they work, which is great in some ways, but also I think it's really important to remember that feminist ways of working, they really have their roots in grassroots organisations, women-led organisations, organisations outside of the UK, the US, etc. And so going back to what I was saying at the beginning, I think it's about working in a way that shows more empathy, more flexibility, more understanding for seldom heard voices or excluded groups, and also working in a way that's more equitable. And that includes anything from how you partner with other organisations to how you recognise the needs of populations who've been displaced, etc. And particularly in Ukraine, because of the kind of unique personality of the humanitarian response here, I think it's really interesting to think about feminist leadership, women's-led leadership, etc.
Thank you for sharing your understanding, because many organizations, especially here in Ukraine, can the very the meaning of feminist leadership. Maybe you can tell us some real-life decision-making of feminist leadership, something what you see on practice.
Yeah. I think there's some really great examples that have come out from the piece of research that we've been doing with Open Space Works here based here in Kyiv, and just looking at the personality of the response here in Ukraine and the number of organisations which have become women-led. And I think one of the things that really came out in that research, and it sort of resonated with me from my experience outside of Ukraine and other humanitarian responses, is how women-led organizations in this response have really been able to respond to the needs of displaced women, displaced families, thinking more holistically about what they need, etc. And also that kind of tension between a lot of the organizations that we spoke to for this piece of research, they're being led by people who are also affected by this conflict since the full-scale invasion and before that. And so I think a lot of our experience kind of shows up in the way that support has been delivered, and thinking about also what psychological support humanitarian workers need. I think that's quite a kind of feminist leadership style, I guess is the word, where we're not just thinking about providing aid in a really kind of transactional way. Actually. We're also thinking about psychological support, not just for women and girls, for entire populations, and also thinking about how to look after our humanitarian workers and kind of think about burnout, think about pressure, etc.
Feminist leadership embraced by some large international organizations emphasize inclusive power-sharing approaches that center the rights of women, I think, girls and marginalized groups, but does linking women-led organization with feminist leadership oversimplify, I think, complex leadership realities?
Yeah, I think it does. I think there is a bit of a tendency to assume that women-led organizations delivering humanitarian assistance are automatically good examples of feminist leadership, or the two things are synonymous with one another. I think actually feminist leadership is about a way of doing things, a way of thinking, a more holistic approach, etc. And often that can show up in women-led organizations, but the two things aren't intrinsically linked. And I think the risk with kind of labeling women-led organizations as automatically feminist is that sometimes the label of feminist is a bit problematic for some people, or they don't necessarily identify with it, or the brand of feminism that the humanitarian community is talking about feels quite kind of privileged, quite Western, quite white often, and particularly in other places that I've worked, including Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, that brand of feminism doesn't feel relevant. And so it can be actually quite an excluding and polarizing term for some women-led organizations, I think, and the work that they do. So I think we're kind of starting to get into a space where we're interrogating that relationship a little bit, which is super interesting, but it means we have to have some quite complex conversations about what it means to different people.
Подкаст «За лаштунками допомоги». Щоб допомога допомагала.
Women leadership, women can lead in different ways. So if there a risk that by labeling certain approaches as feminism, we create like a one-size-to-all approach, and how to avoid it for your sound?
Yeah, I think we're just at the beginning of a journey with this idea of feminist leadership and how it shows up in humanitarianism particularly. And I think maybe the example of Ukraine is quite special because of the nature of the conflict and the majority of men of a certain age being conscripted, and therefore organizations often being led by women, etc. And then some of the analysis we've done to see how networks of organizations have developed, different types of humanitarian delivery has developed, and different types of organizations have kind of sprung up in this conflict. I think it is quite different to other places. And so I'd love to encourage a bit more kind of communication between organizations in Ukraine, INGOs, and also organizations which are working in different conflicts, different contexts completely, to understand a bit more about what are the different types, if you like, of feminist leadership, what do they look like in different types of women-led organizations, and then what does that look like in different types of conflict. So, for example, in this project, we've done this piece of research. We've also done quite a lot of research around the earthquake in Turkey and Syria. And the landscape from humanitarian organizations there is very, very different. It's much more established. There's a much wider network of organizations that have been around for a long time, but there's fewer women-led organizations. And also a kind of Western branded feminism can be particularly contentious in that context too. So I'd love to see a bit more comparison, a bit more dialogue, sort of pushing against the one-size-fits-all label. It's quite a long answer.
No. What a Ukrainian woman can learn from the women worldwide in women leadership in humanitarian aid?
I think that's an interesting question, because I think one of the things that's really struck me about working with the researchers that we worked on for this piece of research, and also getting to meet some of the organizations that are working to deliver aid all across Ukraine, was that the humanitarian response here in Ukraine has its own personality, I think, and it's responding to the unique needs of a really diverse population of Ukraine and lots of people on the move, etc. And we also looked at organizations in Poland. And I think there was some quite good kind of cross-learning between organizations in Poland and organizations in Ukraine. The organizations in Poland were kind of newer and younger, whereas there was a bit more of an established CSO, INGO network in Ukraine. So I think there was a bit of a cross-learning there. But I think that the context and the other conflicts that are happening around the world, in some ways it's like comparing apples and oranges. And so it's sometimes a bit difficult to have lessons which read across to different organizations and different conflicts. But I do think there's something to be learned about, as I said at the beginning, something about feminist leadership in working in networks, working with power sharing and power shifting between organizations, working in a way that's equitable. And I think INGOs really need to lead the way in terms of equitable working and finding ways to shift power away from kind of power hoarding, etc. But I mean, I don't think I'd want to say that the Ukrainian humanitarian sector has a huge amount to learn. I think it has a huge amount to offer in terms of like, how has this worked out here in this really organic way that all these women-led organizations have kind of sprung up? How are they different to organizations that are maybe not women-led? Is there examples of feminist leadership in organizations which are actually led by men? I think it's very like personal to each conflict. Yeah.
Thank you. It was interesting answer. Apples and oranges is a great example to understand all of that. So I think that Ukrainian women are so independent, but I think we are more powerful when we gather in groups. Do you see this such as a style of leadership? We like to leader and take responsibility independently, or when someone supports us, we stay more confident in humanitarian aid and in our thoughts and doings.
I think like the humanitarian situation in Ukraine is interesting, because I think directly after the full-scale invasion, there were huge amounts of investment in organizations in Ukraine and also across the border in Poland, and also organizations that maybe repurposed themselves to become humanitarian organizations that maybe started off providing a different kind of support to various communities around the country. And I think what came out in this piece of research that we've been doing with Mariana and her team is that it shows like an amazing level of collaboration between different organizations and kind of information sharing and signposting, etc. And I think that really shows this kind of strong network of organizations in Ukraine, and also quite a lot of confidence from the international community in terms of funding these organizations who maybe started off doing something different before the invasion, and then they became humanitarian organizations. And so I think hopefully, I mean, but now that I guess the landscape has changed massively, like a lot of international actors are leaving Ukraine, the funding situation is very different. And so I think it'll be interesting to see how things evolve as organizations who have intentionally or not been working in a feminist way, how they're able to kind of evolve with the changing landscape and what support they need around that. At the HLA, we've found that we've tried to be flexible in how we've supported organizations in terms of, first of all, supporting them in understanding humanitarian infrastructure, etc., if they needed support with that, or kind of humanitarian standards. And now we're trying to move into a different kind of support, which is more like leadership support, more support with scaling operations or fundraising or etc. So it's like we're trying to evolve with the organizations in Ukraine. So I think, you know, there's so much evidence of amazing impact from organizations working in this response. And now it's just about what support is needed, what's available. So everything's shifting.
Подкаст «За лаштунками допомоги».
From funding structures to partnerships to accountability, what shift would support leadership in Ukraine that's already happening rather than defining it from the outside?
I think continued confidence and funding is really important. I also think, I keep talking about equitable partnerships, but I think there is a dangerous tendency within the international community to kind of impose its ideas or its frameworks on local and national actors. And actually, I think listening to local and national actors in terms of, you know, what their aims and objectives are, how they want to provide humanitarian support in their way, their knowledge and expertise of the context, I think that should guide how the international sector shifts power. So it's funding, partnerships, various kinds of support, but it needs to be led by the needs and ideas of local and national actors. And I think that particularly is relevant to the idea of feminist leadership, because it doesn't work if it's imposed, and it doesn't work if it's a framework which is brought in by an actor which has more experience working in a completely different context. And so I think I also keep talking about the kind of personality of the humanitarian response in Ukraine and maintaining that and adapting things to fit with it.
Okay, something maybe you have some insight from the last searches you do, and you can share it with us.
Just some insights in terms of key findings.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I think one of the main things that came out for me in this piece of research was the level of commitment from the organisations, the women-led organisations that the researchers spoke to, and how passionate they are about the work that they do, and how some of them never kind of intended to become a humanitarian organisation, which is now delivering aid to populations across Ukraine 2 years down the line, 2.5 years later. But there is this amazing level of passion and commitment, and also in like a growing level of expertise in how best to support really diverse populations with really different needs. Also in terms of their expertise in delivering support, holistic support to women and girls, and that kind of shared understanding, I think. Like, these organisations are often led by people who are also affected by, you know, the conflict in Ukraine since the full-scale invasion. They've also been displaced, perhaps. They also may have lost people to the conflict. And so they really have an understanding of it's not just about food and shelter and kind of traditional humanitarian delivery. It's also about emotional support, providing support around childcare, etc. And so that was something that I was kind of expecting, I guess, when we had the idea to commission this piece of research, but it really comes out in the research. But I think another thing that you could get a bit lost in the findings from this research is the level of potential burnout amongst these organisations, because there's so much passion. Often there's an issue with there's been no break since, you know, operations started. Then maybe they got a lot of investment from the humanitarian sector, and now things have scaled up, and you know, there was a lot of talk about not having time to kind of reflect or rest or kind of work to improve things or, you know, think about skills, etc. So that's another thing that really came out for me.
Okay, if some women who are just doing their work in humanitarian aid but feel some potential to take more and more responsibility for some decision in humanitarian aid in Ukraine, what you can recommend them? Maybe something to learn, something read, watch, maybe go abroad and learn some things.
I think that's a great question. I think the first thing is, well, the one thing we've learned in the HLA during this project is the power of networking and peer support. So just bringing people together to discuss what's happening in their organisations, what's going right, what's going wrong, where they might be able to kind of share and strengthen capacities and share skills, etc., has been really, really valuable. So I guess just kind of interacting with the sector here in Ukraine, and there's lots of different forums, etc., to do that. And also informal networks are really, really important. I think also where possible, taking time to kind of reflect on their own leadership journeys. Like we've had really positive results from things like coaching and mentoring, where you kind of pair a leader at a local or national actor, maybe with somebody, a more experienced humanitarian, who really understands what it's like to lead an organisation through a humanitarian response, and can provide kind of guidance and peer support and help to kind of problem solve. That's another way that we found to kind of build leadership and build confidence and skills. And I guess finally, it was interesting what you said about going abroad and going elsewhere, because I think there's a real danger that in humanitarian response, it's seen that international staff can just work anywhere, even if they don't speak the language or know the context. And actually, I think maybe like Ukrainian humanitarian actors might be at risk of being pigeonholed in only having skills that are relevant to Ukraine, whereas actually that's not the case at all. You know, there might be a way that
we remember about apples and oranges, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But, you know, like someone who's had a lot of experience of delivering, you know, support in kind of water and sanitation or something here in Ukraine might have a lot to offer a crisis, maybe around an earthquake in Turkey, Syria, or something like that. So I think those skills are transferable, and I think it's important to offer opportunities up as well. So maybe that's about working for a different kind of actor, or maybe that's about spending time in a different country working on a different kind of response. There's lots of options.
Maybe there are some things of research that I don't ask you, but you want to share it with our audience.
I think the main thing about the research that we've done over the last 18 months is that we really wanted it to be led by researchers who are based here in Ukraine and also in Poland, because, you know, I've been conducting research for a decade, but so the context of Ukraine was kind of unfamiliar to me. And so from the very beginning, we wanted this research to be led by researchers who are working in Ukraine, have a high level of expertise in Ukraine. And also because I think during the data collection, that would, you know, be a much greater level of shared understanding what the right questions are, and also filling the right evidence gaps. This research is also really for organisations working in Ukraine. It's relevant to the international sector too. We really want the international sector to engage with it and read it, but we really, you know, we translated it into Ukrainian, we translated it into Polish. We really wanted it to be a product which is useful and also reflective for organisations working here. And so we've been really lucky with how well this process has gone with Open Space Works Ukraine. They kind of immediately we had this great relationship with them, and that really helped the research process to bring out these findings which maybe wouldn't have come to light if it had been an international team conducting the research. And so I think that's why the product is as great as it is.
Thank you for this conversation. It's really interesting and I think helpful for many people and many women in Ukraine, and I'm turned on Ukraine. Друзі, дякуємо. Я сподіваюся, що ви зрозуміли частинку нашої розмови. Як я й обіцяла, у соцмережах Радіо Сковорода буде більше якихось таких визначних тез, які ви зможете забрати з собою, і прикладів, які зможете поширювати. Тому не перемикайтесь, це подкаст «За лаштунками допомоги», і шукайте наступні або попередні випуски на усіх подкаст-платформах.
«За лаштунками допомоги» – подкаст про гуманітарне реагування та допомогу від Open Space Works Ukraine та Радіо Сковорода.